Hello and welcome to Tête-à-Tête, France 24's flagship interview show. Our guest today is Vali Nasr. He is professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at John Hopkins University in Washington. Thank you very much for being with us. I should add that you're one of the foremost analysts of your native country, Iran. And obviously, we're going to talk about Iran and a surprise, let's use the word, the election of a reformist president, Masoud Pezeshkian. The election was organized after the accidental death of President Ebraim Raissi, and he won in the second round against an ultra-conservative, Saeed Jalili. He was allowed, first of all, to run, and he won. How much of a surprise is it for you?
There's a fair amount of surprise here. Not so much that he was allowed to run, because I think the supreme leader and the establishment understood that unless they allowed a reformist to run, they were going to have a very, very low turnout election. And they didn't want that, because that would show the delegitimization of the Islamic Republic. So they allowed him to run, but he got through to the second round. And the other surprise was that actually the candidate that probably was favored by both the Revolutionary Guards and the supreme leader, which is a former Revolutionary Guard commander and mayor of Tehran, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, did not make it to the second round. So in a sense, the supreme leader and the establishment had a choice between two candidates that they didn't want, the ultra-conservative and the reformist. And in the end, Pezeshkian pulled through. So it was counter to even the way that the inside Iran, the regime had hoped this would turn out.
Right, but there was still very low turnout, low turnout for the first round, a bit more in the second round. What does it tell you?
It says that there is still a great deal of overhang of the protest of 2022. And the very low turnout actually probably is in large measure because women in particular did not participate. So as you mentioned, the first round was even lower than 2021, where all the candidates were conservative extremists. And in the second round, it was really fear of Jalili more than expectation of reform that brought people out, because Jalili argued that he doesn't want to talk to the United States. He thinks Iran is doing very well under sanctions. Thank you. We can grow the economy under sanctions. He had no plans for dealing with inflation. And he was openly saying things like that he wants to cut Iran's internet from the world, that he wants to forcibly reimpose hijab on women, enforce it in a way that it's not being done right now. All of which convinced the Iranians that even though they're not enthusiastic about Pezeshkian, their lives can get significantly worse under Jalili. So that accounts for a 40% rise in the participation in the second round, but still that's only 50% of those who could have voted. And that probably will be a concern for the supreme leader.
Right. Was it the expression of what the Iranians really felt, or was it something that the regime wanted and engineered, the outcome?
No, I think if they really wanted to engineer it in a very sort of methodic way, Ghalibaf would right now be president in Iran. I mean, he's a more moderate conservative. He has the trust of the supreme leader, the trust of the Revolutionary Guards, and he didn't make it to the second round. And if they were going to really cheat in a big way, they would have cheated on the participation rate. I mean, this is still an embarrassment to the Islamic Republic in both rounds. So I think it is not the outcome they wanted, but it's an outcome that they can live with. And so going forward, it would really come down to how much room does Pezeshkian have to deliver on things that he called for during the campaign.
Right. Let's talk about him a bit. Can you tell us who he is? He is a heart surgeon. He also comes from a different ethnic background than most Iranians. What does it tell you about him?
Well, he's not the kind of reformist that we saw in the past, like with President Khatami or Mir Hossein Mousavi, who led the Green Movement in 2009. He didn't run on a campaign that I'm here to break down the system, that I'm going to push things forward. He rather came on a campaign on I'm going to get things done on a daily basis for you. I'm going to try to lift sanctions so we can deal with inflation, the economy, and I'm going to make life easier with you before these rules that the Islamic Republic has on women and certain other issues. His persona is also quite important. He's a heart surgeon. He's half from Azerbaijan, half Kurdish, and he did appeal to those ethnic groups, and they voted for him in large numbers, and that's one reason why he's elected. But he's also viewed as a genuinely pious person. He's a tutor of the Quran. He knows religious texts by heart. Not an ideologue in a sense of, but actually a practicing Muslim in the mold of the early generation revolutionaries. He lives humbly. His wife was killed 30 years ago along with his son. He never remarried. He raised his own children. And he's seen as being uncorrupt. And so some of these also appeal to some conservative voters, that he's very different in terms of his profile from the ultra-corrupt sort of elite that run Iran in conjunction with the Revolutionary Guard, benefiting from sanctions, having lavish lifestyles, their hands in everything. So it's not only about politics of what he's going to do on reform. It's also what he represented in terms of where Iranian society's thinking is on these issues of inequality, corruption.
Right, but let's take the two main issues that he has advocated for, loosening the rules about the mandatory hijab and engaging with the West with the objective to lift the sanctions.
So on the first one, he didn't come out and say, I'm going to change the laws to actually make mandatory hijab not necessary, because that's not even in his forte. That's up to the parliament, which he doesn't control. What he really began to said to the voters is that I'm not going to enforce it. I'm not going to make it my priority like my predecessor did. The first thing Raisi did, he came in the office, was to let loose the morality police to enforce this on women. And he basically said that we need to loosen things for people to be able to be, we have to be inclusive, which is a positive message. On lifting of sanctions, he was much more forward. He made a case to the Iranian public that the reason that the economy is failing in Iran is because of sanctions. And sanctions won't get lifted unless Iran has a positive diplomatic engagement with the West. And so he said, it's my intent to lift the sanctions, and therefore it's my intent to engage them diplomatically. That is a very different message from the ultra-conservative member who was basically saying, no, I don't want to engage the West, I don't want to give up anything, and we're doing fine under sanctions.
But can this happen? I mean, I'm just going to read you the reaction from the State Department. We have no expectations these elections will lead to fundamental change in Iran's direction. As the candidate himself have said, Iranian policy is set by the supreme leader. It's not a very good response.
It's not a very good thing, and I don't think Europeans and Americans have reacted well. This is still an opportunity, just like Rouhani
They've been burned before.
Well, they were not burned when Rouhani became president. Rouhani did come to the table, he did negotiate, and Iran did implement the deal. It was the United States that moved away from the deal, and then the United States that prevented the Europeans from actually continuing with the deal in a serious way. So, when Rouhani came to power, he basically followed the same approach. We're not going to solve everything under the sun, but on the most important thing, which is the nuclear issue, we're willing to engage in an exchange.
Is that still possible, given that Iran has already made advances on its nuclear program, and in the West, especially in Washington, things are very uncertain?
Well, true, but the options before the West are very simple. You either let Iran become nuclear, or you go to war with Iran, or you make a deal to stop them where they are, and maybe roll back a bit.
It's not too late.
It's not too late, but these are your only options. I mean, it's not like you can that Iran one morning is going to unilaterally say, we're just giving up on this thing without a diplomatic process. So the United States and Europe have a better chance of at least testing the water on a diplomatic front with Pezeshkian than they would have if Jalili had become president or when Raisi was president. So the glass is half full as opposed to half empty. And it really comes down to whether Europeans and the Americans would engage with Pezeshkian or just reject the whole thing. Because if they do, then Pezeshkian's going to fail.
Right. Is there still time? The clock is ticking, especially if Donald Trump returns to the White House. Or do you think that because he's a deal maker, this doesn't prevent an eventual deal if there is real engagement?
I think the Iranians, like many in the Middle East, are already expecting Donald Trump to come back, or at least are preparing themselves for that eventuality. So I think the Iranians under Pezeshkian are ready for Trump and are ready for Biden. In fact, Pezeshkian's chief of his campaign said, Trump is a businessman, we're businessmen, we can cut a deal, which is essentially a signal to say we're not focused on only one administration. So I think they're saying we're ready to talk. Now let's see if the West is ready to also test the waters with them.
Right. Just very quickly, what about the regional impact? He already wrote a letter to the leader of Hezbollah saying we will continue to support, we'll stay behind you. Do you expect any change in Lebanon, Yemen, or other places?
No. I mean, first of all, this was pro forma that he has to do that.
Right.
I mean, for domestic purposes, etc. The regional policy is not in the hands of the president. It's in the hands of the Revolutionary Guards and the Supreme Leader. And currently, in the current environment, I guess the region is in a war, pretty much. And therefore, again, things can change, but through some form of negotiation, not through Iran unilaterally doing something. But I think things with Iran are extremely complicated. The United States and the West have issues with Iran on three fronts: on the nuclear issue, on the regional issue, and on Russia and Ukraine. And these things are interconnected, but there's not going to be one grand diplomatic event that's going to solve all of these. You have to pick at one strand first and then build towards that. And the strand that has been on the table and is on the table for now is the nuclear issue. That's the place to begin. That's the place where the president in Iran also has a lot more say, because whenever you come to diplomacy, ultimately it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that has to do the negotiations.
Vali Nasr, I want to thank you very much for being our guest here on Tête à Tête on France 24. And I want to thank you all for watching this show.